Hi, it's me again, Leslie or Abdul Karim, Abdullah, take your choice. Today, in this brief video, I'd like to talk about some project that I have been engaged over the last little while. It's basically putting together a few papers I have written. They are available on ResearchGate and academia. On the ResearchGate they are available under my Muslim name, which is Abdul Karim Abdullah, and on the ResearchGate they are available under my legal name, which is Leslie Tarabesi. So I had the idea not so long ago to take a few of these papers and put them together in a book, because I realized that the 5 or 6 of those papers, I realized something I didn't know before, that actually they were more or less on the same theme, approaching the same issue or problem from 5 or 6 different directions. And I realized there was a common factor there, so I thought it wouldn't be so difficult to put it together. So I did that in pages. And basically what it's about is about what I call an eclipse of revealed knowledge by other factors that have come into the picture. In particular, 2 factors. One is rationalism, and the second one is what we normally refer to as tradition. Now, in the book I'm looking at both European and the Islamic civilizations, although I only have a single chapter on the Western civilization, and the remaining 5 or so chapters are on the Islamic civilization. So now today I'd like to focus on what I call a number of assumptions that have been made by jurists in the process of integrating new knowledge into existing knowledge. And what I'm trying to say is that this process of somehow eclipse, as I called it, in the Islamic civilization is partly due to the rise of tradition, including the prophetic traditions, and to a position where they seem to loom so large as to make us sometimes forget about the Quran. And as we know, in traditional jurisprudence, the Quran occupies the first place as a source of, or root of the law, or root of the Sharia. So now, what were these factors that enabled for this to take place? And after thinking about it for quite some time, and tinkering with the ideas, I kind of narrowed it down to 4 factors. So let me just briefly go through these 4 factors. The first one was that it was, remember the question is, how did tradition become or manage to become so prestigious, if you like, or so large in the thinking of Muslims today about our own religion? How did that happen? So what I'm suggesting is that, of course, as you know, in history the Quran came first, brought to us by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, and later traditions developed out of that, and they were recorded about 2 or 250 years after his demise. So now, one factor that facilitated the inclusion or the incorporation of tradition into the body of Islamic knowledge was that, and that was an assumption about the Quran. And this assumption is that there are certain passages in the Quran which can be considered as unclear or ambiguous. These are the passages that the Quran refers to as the ayat mutashabihat, chapter 3, verse number 7, a very famous verse. And I'm suggesting that this term, the Arabic term, although I don't claim to be especially an expert in the Arabic language, but I looked this one up particularly, and normally it is translated as unclear or ambiguous, but actually it doesn't mean that. It means allegorical or metaphorical. the word mutashabihat implies some similarity. So, for instance, it says elsewhere in Arabic, tashabahat qulubuhum. It means their hearts are similar in reference to some people. So the first assumption was that the Quran had some ambiguous passages. Now, what is important about this observation is that, first of all, it alleges that, or attributes a degree of imperfection to the Quran, about which we are normally used to think of as perfect and really inimitable, a flawless document. The second thing to notice about this the statement that the Quran contains ambiguous passages is that if it is true that there are such passages in this book, then if we want to understand those passages, we need someone or something to explain it. And indeed, that was the reason why traditions were brought in as a kind of reference to help explain unclear passages in the book. So the first assumption was the view that the Quran contains some ambiguous or unclear passages. So that's the first assumption. Now the second assumption that was made to facilitate the rise of tradition to a pretty lofty rank, we might say, is the identification of tradition as revelation. You see, initially it was only the Quran that was considered as revelation, wahi in Arabic. But later on, jurists have argued that the prophetic traditions also constitute revelation, although not the same type as the Quran. The revelation implicit in the prophetic traditions have been called, in English the term used is internal. These revelations have been described as internal revelation, while the Quran, it is maintained, constitutes external or manifest revelation. So these two types of revelations are actually complementary and they do not conflict with each other. So once again, the second assumption was that the prophetic traditions also constitute a form of revelation. Now, according to some jurists, in some cases these traditions, in the case of the so-called widely reported traditions that we call the mutawatir traditions, that these particular traditions are in fact equal in authority to the authority of the Quran. So that is the second assumption, that the traditions also constitute revelation. Now the third assumption is that has to do with the relationship between tradition and reason or human rationality. And this assumption is that tradition comes before human reason, human logic, or human rationality. In other words, that it is a higher authority than human reason. And this is recognized in the ranking of the roots of the Sharia, which start with the Quran, then proceed with the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be on him, then move on to the consensus of the jurists, and finally to the thought of the individual jurists that normally we call ijtihad, but is a reference to the use of rationality in tackling the problems in jurisprudence. So that was the third assumption. Very briefly to review, the first one was that the Quran contains unclear passages. The second one was that the tradition is a form of revelation. And the third one is that tradition is a higher authority than human rationality. Now, what is the fourth and last of these assumptions which have enabled tradition to rise to its prominence in the world of Islam? The fourth and last of these assumptions is that because of its special position as revelation of the tradition also should be used to judge the Quran And this is expressed in a popular saying that the, I quote, Sunnah judges the Quran. In Arabic, al-Sunnah qadiya al-Quran. Now what this means is that whenever you have any problem or a question with the Quran, and whenever you don't understand anything, you refer to the Sunnah or the Hadith to find an explanation for the meaning of this obscure or ambiguous passage. So these then are the four assumptions, and as you can see, they are all related to each other. The fact that the Quran contains some ambiguous passages implies that it requires explanation or clarification. Next, the fact that the tradition or the Sunnah is also revelation makes it possible to consult it and even to employ the tradition to clarify the ambiguous passages in the Quran. And the third one is that tradition is actually a higher authority than reason. And the fourth one is that tradition actually judges the Quran. Okay, so these are the four assumptions, and they had, I think, quite far-reaching implications, which I'm not going to go into today because it's, I think, too much. I want to keep this video short. My original intent was to keep it at a maximum of 5 minutes, so I'll try to wrap it up as soon as I can. But I will say that these four assumptions had far-reaching effects because they altered the way Muslims understand not only revelation but also tradition, and they also altered, I think, the way the Islamic law was developed, because in some cases it seems that certain statements or views were taken from tradition and included in the Sharia, for instance in penal law, in criminal law, what we call hudud, even though there seems to be no evidence for this particular punishment in the Quran. Two examples will suffice. We find that in the Sharia has included stoning to death for adultery, even though the Quran does not prescribe that at all. It prescribes 100 lashes. And secondly, we find that for the sin of apostasy, for which no punishment is prescribed in the Quran, based on a tradition, there is the punishment of death also. So these two punishments in particular have been taken from tradition, and somehow the punishments from the Quran was ignored in the case of adultery, and a completely new punishment was implemented in the case of apostasy, for which there is no basis in the Quran. So now one last point I would like to add in particular is why is it that the jurists felt it was necessary to designate tradition as revelation? And I think the answer to that is to be found in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5 of the Quran, verses 44, 46 and 47, which say basically that anyone who judges by anything other than what Allah has revealed is one of three things: a fasik, which means a rebel, a zalim, a wrongdoer, or there's the last one. Now I have trouble remembering the last one. Fasik, zalim, and kafir, a disbeliever. So if we want to judge the Quran, we can only do it from the perspective of revelation. And since the tradition has become a revelation, now we are in a position to judge the Quran from the position of tradition. So I think that's all for today. If you have any questions, write them down in the comments section below, and perhaps I can have a look. And if I am able to answer it, I could perhaps make another short video on that. So that's all for today. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.